Thanks for having me. This is really exciting. I'm been really looking forward. This is the first time that I get to present at the Penn State University, even though it's virtual. That is one highlight. My name is Armin Briegel. I run the weblog Scripting OS 10, which you've probably encountered. I also work as a consultant for the Apple authorized enterprise reseller Pro Warehouse. We work here in the Netherlands and some of Europe as well. And today I'm going to talk about moving to Z Shell. This is my Campfire session. Well, we all know by now that Catalina has brought many changes. Some of them weren't really very pleasant for us as admins. Some of them are kind of nice. Today I'm going to focus on one simple, well, not simple, but fairly small and minor change. Nearly exactly a year ago, when Apple introduced Catalina on stage, like a day later, there was this small knowledge base article that popped up that some people noticed, which said, and you know what, going forward, amongst all the other things that we're going to do in Catalina, we're going to switch to Z Shell as the default shell on macOS. And the knowledge base article is actually fairly detailed on how you can do the change, but it didn't go into much detail. So I've been like probably most of you, I've stuck with the default shell bash on macOS because A, it was easy. And I thought, well, you know, Apple probably put some thought into why they chose this as the default shell, even though many people had told me like, you should try Z Shell, it's really cool, there's stuff you can enable. And I looked at that and it was all like about colorful prompts and everything. So when the change came, I did what everybody would do. I went to my favorite search engine and I entered Z Shell tutorial for Mac, and there are plenty of them out there. Believe me, I will summarize all of them for you. The first step in nearly all of these tutorials is to run brew install Z Shell. Now, first of all, they just assume you have brew most of the time, because why would you not? And then they don't really explain why you need to install Z Shell, because Z Shell is pre-installed on macOS. Sometimes you may want a newer version, but they don't explain that. They don't explain how to configure Mac to get the new version either. They just like run this. The next thing you have to run is always install Oh My Z Shell. And it's always with a curl command piped into SH, which of course for most Mac admins makes our hair stand up. You know, earlier on they assumed I have brew. Why aren't they using brew to install Oh My Z Shell? The third step is fireworks. That's when they start working on the install this theme, and it'll be really colorful. And I'm exaggerating here. The tutorials usually go into more than just the themes, but that's surprisingly always a major part of it. I was dissatisfied with that, and I started writing my own how to move to Z Shell post on my blog. And you know, it's a bit of a complex topic, so there were more posts and more. And honestly, I'm still writing posts on that. I actually made a longer presentation at MacSysAdmin last fall in October, but that's nearly 8 months ago, so I have many updates. I have a few new things to tell. And I wrote a book about it, which is available on Apple Book, which also goes into a lot of detail with lots of steps. I don't have URLs in this slide. I think there's one. Aside from this one, all the links, all the notes, all the references I put in there, you can find them on this website, scriptingos10.com/campfire. And if I did everything right this afternoon, it should be live now. And once the video is available, I will link that too, but the slides and all the links and my notes are there. So Z Shell, it's pronounced Z Shell. Which is obvious for the American listeners. For the international ones, they usually want to say Z Shell, but then the pun doesn't work, so it's Z Shell. It's one of a family of shells, and most of them kind of came out of the same time frame. Sometime in the 80s, we had this explosion of different shells. We had Corn Shell, TC Shell, which followed onto C Shell, which is not Z Shell, just to get the pronunciation right, and of course Bash. Z Shell is a comparative latecomer in '89, but it's still, you know, more than 30 years ago. It's been around a long time as well. The one thing to note in this diagram is Bash hasn't stood still either. There is Bash 4 and Bash version 5 since last January, but since Bash 4, Bash is GNU Public License version 3, which Apple will not touch with the proverbial 10-foot pole, which is why we don't get Bash 4 and Bash 5 in macOS. If you look at the history of shells on macOS, which also goes back 20 years by now, interestingly enough, Bash wasn't even in the early releases. In 10.0 and 10.1, PC shell was the default shell, and Z shell was already present on macOS. Bash didn't join until Jaguar, and then in Panther 10.3, Apple switched to Bash as the default shell. The reason being back then, and I'm kind of speculating here, but I'm quite certain that was the reason, was that Apple wanted to be more attractive to the Linux web developers and the Linux admins, and Bash was the de facto standard on Linux. And that's why macOS got Bash and got Bash as the default shell. And we got that until last year when in 10.15 Apple switched to Z shell. The reason for the switch is fairly obvious from this chart. The last major update to Bash in macOS was in 10.5 Leopard in 2008, if I recall correctly. And since then, we haven't gotten a major update, only patches. The last patch was in 2013 for the shell shock vulnerability. Other than that, we're working with a nearly 13-year-old binary by now. So the future of this is definitely a bit questionable. What actually changed in Catalina? Well, if you create a new user, either you're on a fresh system or you're creating a new user on Catalina, the default shell will now be bin Z shell. Existing users, when you upgrade to Catalina, will keep whatever is set as their shell, probably bin bash, but whatever you've chosen before. And when you open a shell using the built-in bash, bin bash version 3, you will get this dialog that tells you, well, you should probably move to Z shell, and here's how. And it links to the aforementioned support article. If you do the switch to Z shell, and you don't have to wait for Catalina, if you're stuck on Mojave or even High Sierra on your machine, Z shell is already present there. Z shell has been around since 10.0. If you do switch to Z shell, not much will actually change. Z shell is very compatible to Bash. The default behavior, you enter the command, commands run, is very, very similar, if not the same. The most obvious change is the prompt changes from $1 in Bash to a percentage sign in Z shell. I don't like either. We'll change that later. And even if you don't like Z shell, you can switch back to bin bash, or you could install Bash version 5, which gives you all the goodness and all the modern Bash stuff. It's not trivial to install Bash version 5. You could use brew, or I have a post on my weblog that explains how to install Bash version 5 without brew. Apple is telling us surprisingly strongly, they're rarely this definite, that maybe it's time to start thinking of moving away from bin bash. This is, of course, a prolonged process. Even Apple uses bash scripts in several places, and I'm sure they will have to work on this. But if we've seen anything in the past years, Apple will make changes quickly when they have to. So we could be talking months here. 10.16 will probably be announced next week, 1.5 weeks from now. But on the other hand, Apple has deprecated stuff and left it hanging around for a long time, like cron or login hooks. So we don't really know how long Bash will be around. Personally, I'm hoping for years, but I'm preparing for months. When you look online in social media, Twitter is always great. You see lots of people complaining, I switched to Z shell, now everything's broken. How does that combine with what I just said, where I said, Z shell, Bash, not really that different. The main reason, if everything breaks when you switch to Z shell, are the configuration files. Like browsers, they do basically the same thing, but Safari has different configuration files from Chrome, has different configuration files from Firefox. Shells have different configuration files. And if you've configured things in your Bash profile, they won't be in your Z shell profile. And you might not have even configured them, because third-party tools and installers sometimes do that. What do the configuration files do? Well, each terminal window that you open gets their own shell. And this shell has an environment. It contains variables which contain information. The most important one being the path, which is where the shell will look for commands. But other variables are there, like the current working directory, your home directory, and any other environment variables you might have set. There are shell options, which enable and disable certain functions and features of the shell. And there are aliases and functions, which work kind of like macros or shortcuts, or can even redefine commands if you want to. Now, each window has its own environment, and if I wanted to configure my shell to be slightly differently to enable some nice new stuff, I would have to enter these commands every time I open a new terminal window, which is of course not efficient. And I want to put all of that into a configuration file. And then if I put that in the right file, the shell will know to run these commands every time a new shell is opened, and I get all of my shells in all new terminal windows configured like I need them to. The configuration file depends on the shell. In sh, we have .profile, and then we have different ones in bash or Z shell, depending on when you want them to run. And I won't go into the details, the differences between the login and interactive. And this is the simple version for macOS. It's different on different operating systems. We use .profile for sh, .bash_profile for bash, and .zshrc for Z shell. Those are the most important configuration files. Again, you can set environment variables, most importantly the path, shell options, aliases and functions. You can reconfigure your prompt, which is kind of gaudy, but can be very, very useful. And you can enable and add other tools and modules to your shell, especially Z shell. Z shell is extremely flexible that way. Z shell is so flexible concerning modules and themes that there are module managers for Z shell. The most famous one, I've mentioned it before, is Oh My Z shell, which literally has hundreds and hundreds of themes and modules and things that you can configure and enable. There are others, Presto and Anti-Gen, and some themes that just focus on a single thing, like providing a good theme. And I often get asked, so yeah, I can make my shell light up like a Christmas tree. Do I need Oh My Z shell to run Z shell, like all the tutorials say? Recently, my wife found this utterly entertaining video on Twitter, and I thought, well, this is kind of a good analog. If you look at this guy, he's obviously put a lot of effort and skill and athleticism into finding ways to climb over a fence. And it's fun to watch. It would probably be fun to try if I didn't break my leg when I tried that. And you have to appreciate that. But is this something that you would recommend to everyone? This is how you should cross a fence? No. And I see Oh My Z shell to work kind of the same way. If you like managing hundreds of themes, if you need to be on the latest and greatest modules and plugins, and you have dozens of them and need a manager for them, by all means, use Oh My Z shell or Anti-Gen or one of those. For most people, just climb over the fence like a normal person and configure your configuration files by hand, because you want to add some things. And I'll show you some things you will want to add to your configuration files, because the Z shell out of the box is very basic. It's in the most compatible setting to bash, but we want to enable some things which are really cool. Completions are one thing that we want to kind of enable and make better. The tab key is your friend in the shell. By default, Z shell has tab completion, very much like bash 3. Commands and paths, you hit the tab key and it will complete it. If you add this autoload command to your configuration file, then you will get much more. One of the things you get is partial completion. So you can type a path in a partial way. So ULB, that's definitely use a local bin because there's no other path that matches that, and the tab key will complete that. And I can do that with LPB for library preferences by host as well. It saves a lot of typing, speeds up your navigation. It's really kind of neat. You can complete arguments as well. I mentioned that earlier. I can never remember. Oh no, this is the wrong slide. You can complete options. So many commands have dozens and dozens of options. In this case, I typed CP and then the dash and hit the tab key. So the completion system knows I want an option. It will list all the options it knows of for the CP command and give me a short description. There are some commands that have lots and lots. ls has 56 options. This is very, very helpful. You can combine the two I can never remember if the system profiler command is written with an underscore or not. Hint, it is, but I can use tab completion to help me through this. The system profiler command also has these weird arguments that all start with SP and end in data type and are case sensitive, drives you crazy. I can use tab completion to help me through those because it knows of all the options of system profiler. You can use complex commands. HDIUtil has dozens of subcommands or verbs. The completion system is aware of these. And then each subcommand has its own set of options, and these might have other arguments that are limited to this. And I can use tab completion to for these. So I don't have to have the man page open on the side, and I can just use these. These completion rules, they don't come from nowhere. There are literally hundreds of files that describe the completions for various commands. Most of the common Unix commands are built into Z Shell. And if you're on High Sierra or Mojave, you get these 6 Mac-specific commands built in. If you're on Catalina, there's more than 6. We get a lot more in Z Shell 5.7.1, which is really great. But not all Mac-specific commands have these completion rules yet. Z Shell 5.8 was published in February this year. It's not built into macOS yet. I'm curious whether we will see that in 10.16, but I checked and there are no new Mac-specific completion rules in Z Shell 5.8, but you can build your own. The syntax is a bit weird and complicated, but you can do it, so I did. I did one, just for example, for the Jamf binary, because we work with Jamf. I need that a lot. So all the Jamf verbs and the Jamf options can now be auto-completed with a description of the different options. I have open sourced the ones I've built. The black ones I've built. The gray ones is part of a much longer list that I think might still need to be built. The instructions are there on how to add that to your Z Shell. And because it's open source, hey, if you build one, contribute so we can have one central place where we have all these things. Custom prompt. I mentioned it earlier. I showed some. It's not just all gaudy. There's very real usefulness you can have. This is what my prompt in Z Shell looks right now. At least I'm very close to this. Looks like utter hieroglyphics. If you've ever configured the prompt for Bash, this is an improvement, actually. I'll go through this quickly. The first one is the %2 means current working directory, 2 elements of it, and replace the tilde if it's the home directory. So I get tilde/projects. This set of hieroglyphics depends on the previous command. If the previous command ended in a success, it will show me my arrow that I use as the prompt in green. Otherwise, it will show it in red if the previous command failed. And the first part here does pretty much a similar thing. If the previous command failed, it will show me the exit code in red. I find this very useful because so many commands give you extra information in the exit code. For example, pgrep, which searched for running processes, will give me the process ID, but it will also give me an error if there is none. And this is much more visual than just an empty prompt with nothing. I can see, oh yeah, the previous command failed. DSEdit group will print, yes, Armin is a member of, or no, Armin is not a member of, but it will also give me an error code. And again, this is much more visual. It's not just more visual, it helps me when I write scripts, because these commands that give me a useful error code, I don't have to parse their output when I'm writing scripts. I can just use the command, and if it fails, then the if statement is false and will be executed, and if it succeeds, then the if statement will be executed. Makes for much cleaner code. Batch renaming files. Finder has this great thing, which is a common tip that you always find in the tips and tricks. But if I do it from the shell in Bash, I probably have to write a loop. So in this case, I'm looping over all files that end in .txt, and I grab the part before the .txt, and then I rename them, in this case, to .md, just as an example. In Bash, I need to do a loop to do that, which is fairly easy to write, but still kind of cumbersome. Z Shell has a tool built in that I need to enable, but it's built in called ZMV or ZMove. And I can do the same with this one command. So The first thing is look for these files with a wildcard star, and then the wildcard is a regex group, I guess, and William Smith will talk about that in detail later. And I can address that in the second argument with the $1. And that basically means take everything before the .txt and rename it to .md at the end. I can do that with ZMV. ZMV can go totally crazy. This command will take the part before an underscore and the part after an underscore and swap them around. So that's kind of interesting. And this one will replace all underscores with dashes in the files that are available. So ZMV, extremely powerful, takes some learning, getting used to, but can do really cool things. You might have seen that in some of my screenshots. There's a module that you can download and add to Z Shell that will enable syntax highlighting. So it's very much like I get it in a text editor with code, where commands will be in one color and strings and variables in another. That's really useful. You can see here while I'm typing the echo command, it is red because ec is not a valid command. And only when I complete it, it turns green. And I get immediate visual feedback if I've typed a command right or wrong. I can immediately see if I've forgotten to close a quote and things like that. Syntax highlighting. It's a module you have to download and enable, but it's very, very nice. And this is another module that you have to download and enable. And you can tell why people would want module managers, but so far we're at 2, and that's where we're going to stay. So that's manageable without. Auto-suggestion uses the completion and your shell history to suggest things you might want to type, and it will show them as this gray suggestion going forward. And since it uses both the history and the completion, it is usually very good at trying to predict what you want to type. You can hit the right arrow or the tab key to actually do the completion, and especially together with the syntax highlighting, this will make you walk through your commands very, very quickly. So far, we've talked about the interactive part of the shell, where I enter a command, I get the output, enter the next command. Scripting is, of course, another important part of how we use the shell, whether it's bash or sh or even C shell. And as I said earlier, Z shell is very compatible with bash. It was the right choice from Apple to choose Z shell because the changes aren't that big. In most cases, you can replace the shebang, the first line in the script that says, interpret this with bin bash, and replace it with bin Z shell, because they are very, very close. There are a few warnings that I can't go into detail because of time, but there will be links that explain it in detail. Word splitting. So when you substitute a variable, we always have to quote it in bash because otherwise my argument will break into pieces on the spaces. That is less of a thing in Z shell, which in general is good because we don't have to worry about it so much. But there will be situations where you expect the old unsafe bash behavior, and Z shell will behave differently. So that's something to be aware of. The other big thing is Z shell has lists and arrays like bash does, but the array indices start at 1. And we can have a religious argument about whether they should start at 0 or 1. It is how it is. In Z shell, they start at 1. There is a shell option you can switch if you really want them to start at 0, but you have to remember to do that. By default, array indices start at 1. A few others that I've encountered, like the read command is a built-in to Z shell, behaves somewhat differently than the one in bash. And Z shell has associative arrays, which are kind of like dictionaries, very weak dictionaries. They can be useful in certain situations. It's good that we have them now. So my advice for if you have to write a script on macOS is for automation workflows in the shell, what generally we would have done bash so far, Z shell is the right replacement. And I'm not saying go out and try to replace everything that you have in bash with Z shell right away, but as you touch them and update them in the future to prepare for that day where bash will be yanked from the operating system, maybe you want to migrate to Z shell. Keep that in mind. The exception to that are installation scripts, pre and post install scripts in packages. I would recommend sh for using them because Packages, you never can predict in which context they're going to be used, especially if you're a vendor. But even as a Mac admin, they sometimes get used and then used in a different context than you intended them for. And if a package is run from the recovery partition, which happens with scripts such as installer, bootstrapper, or Tucanu's MDS, Mac deploy stick, then there's no Z shell on the recovery, and your Z shell scripts will break. SH is present everywhere. So for installation scripts and packages, I would recommend Z shell. And as soon as you have to handle lots of complex data, with that I mean XML, JSON, API calls, property lists, anything but the simplest calls, you probably want to look at an advanced language, either compiled Swift or Python, Ruby, and Perl. And of course, with Python and the other interpreted high-level languages, you have to consider that the runtimes that Apple has included up to now, and it's still including in Catalina, for these will not be there in the future. So you have to install and manage your own runtimes. And certain projects, such as Monkey and AutoPackage, are now doing that. So we have a model to what to work with. We might be able to use those for our Python scripts, or you build and manage your own. Where MacAdmins, installing and managing and updating software is what we do, what we have to do. Well, now there's one more piece that we have to manage. With that, as a conclusion, switching to Z shell, no reason to panic, but it's something to keep in mind. Even if you don't really care about all the nice stuff in the terminal, the scripting part is important to prepare for, because we don't know how much longer the bash binary will be there. I'm really hoping it will be there for a few more years, but we don't want to be surprised. Join us on the MacAdmins Slack if you have more questions. There are 3 channels. There is a Z shell channel, there is a bash channel, and there is a scripting channel. There's been discussion about merging these 3. It pops up every few weeks, and it usually fails because we can't agree on a name for the combined channel. The busiest of the 3 is the bash channel, and you shouldn't be afraid to ask Z shell questions there either. There will be jokes, but that's the busiest, and we can answer Z shell questions in the bash channel as well. But the Z shell channel is there for the really typical Z shell stuff. So, as I mentioned earlier, you can find the links and the notes and the video once it's online, and the slides on scriptingos10.com Campfire. I am scripting OS 10 in pretty much all of the social media, including MacAdmins Slack. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention, and we can go to the questions.
Awesome, thank you very much. Okay, so our first question is, for those of us managing macOS devices with MDM, like Jamf Pro, what is the impact of using ZSH for management scripts instead of SH? What are the major items to look for in this case?
Well, if you've been using SH so far, you don't have to change that. SH will remain there. There might be small changes there in the future because Apple might have to update that too. And then Z shell is like bash is more than SH, Z shell is more than SH, and a bit more than bash. So because Z shell is on all of the systems, has been on all of macOS so far, you can start using Z shell scripts or changing your existing scripts to Z shell right now, even if you're supporting older macOS versions, because they already have Z shell. It's already there. So aside from the things that I warned about, that the behavior changes slightly for some things, it's a safe thing to do right away. I think you're muted.
Thank you. Our second question, I've had issues with, in parentheses, 2 equal signs causing error. So can you talk to us maybe a little bit about comparison in the Z shell, how we can compare values using maybe equal signs or other options?
I mean, this is fairly out of context, so I have to guess now, but I think this is not actually a Z shell typical thing, but a difference between the more primitive just SH, which uses the single square brackets, and Bash and Z shell, which use the double square brackets for comparisons and tests, because SH doesn't know about double equals as, or shouldn't know about double equals for comparison. And yeah, there's a surprising depth in this answer, if I'm guessing right, because on macOS, when you run a script as sh, it is actually running, it's actually Bash running in sh compatibility mode. And Bash will see the double equal sign and say, yeah, I know what to do with this. But a different sh interpreter, like maybe Z shell or Dash, the Debian Onquist shell, they will see the double equal sign and say sh should not know about this and throw an error. So from the context, I have to guess, but I'm assuming it's something like this. Yeah, make sure your shebang, if you want to use Bash or Z shell features, is actually Bash or Z shell and not sh, because the behavior is different and should be different. You're muted again.
Thank you. How do you change the default behavior of skipping around between tokens and words using escape F and escape B? Bash used to jump spaces and punctuation. Z shell jumps next space only.
I have had that question before, and I do not know it off the top of my head. Brad, please ask that in the Z shell channel, or search in the Z shell channel, because it has been answered before, or ask it again and I will look it up, because it's one configuration command where you tell Z shell to which characters to use to define a word. And yes, I know it's annoying. I changed that too.
Okay, last question. Does ZHS offer, or Z shell offer a contextual history? I.e., if you start typing sudo jamf, can you hit the up arrow and navigate past commands in your history that only start with sudo jamf?
Yes, it does. And it's the same key as in Bash, at least by default. It's Control R, and then you start typing and it will go back. Or you can actually, what I did, it was in one of the many tutorials that I read, is you can start typing and hit the up key, and it will search for everything that starts with what you already typed. But I think you have to configure that. I'd have to look that up. But yes, that feature is there. One thing that I didn't mention today is Z shell actually has a shared history between all the different Z shell instances built in. It's not enabled by default, but it's easily enabled, and that is also actually a fairly cool feature.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, Armin, again, for taking the time to deliver us today's first Campfire session.